It was a quiet afternoon in a suburban neighborhood, and Officer Greg Barnes, a seasoned cop with over 15 years on the force, was on his usual patrol. The streets were calm, lined with rows of houses, and everything seemed routine. Greg was known for being sharp-eyed, often boasting about his ability to spot trouble before it happened. As he drove past a stop sign, a sleek black SUV caught his attention. The vehicle had just rolled through the intersection, failing to make a complete stop. Greg narrowed his eyes and turned on his lights. To him, it was an easy stop, nothing out of the ordinary. He accelerated slightly and pulled the car over to the side of the road. The SUV slowed down and parked near the curb. Inside, Agent Maya Collins sat calmly, her hands resting on the steering wheel. Maya was an FBI agent on her way to a meeting in the city. She had taken this quieter route to avoid traffic, her mind focused on the work ahead. As the flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror, she sighed. A minor stop wasn't how she had planned her day to begin. Greg stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt as he approached the vehicle. He noticed Maya through the tinted window, but didn't immediately recognize who she was. Instead, his thoughts were clouded with assumptions. She was a well-dressed black woman in a high-end car, and to Greg, that alone made her suspicious. Maya rolled down the window, her expression calm and professional. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice even. Greg didn't return the polite tone. "License and registration," he said bluntly, his hand resting near his holster. His tone carried an edge of authority, and Maya picked up on it immediately. She had encountered similar situations before and knew it was best to stay calm and composed. "Of course," Maya replied, reaching for her documents. She handed them over without hesitation. Greg scanned her license, noting her name but not recognizing its significance. To him, she was just another driver who might give him trouble. "You rolled through that stop sign back there," he said, his voice gruff. "What's your hurry?" Maya smiled politely. "I'm heading to a work meeting, officer. I didn't realize I hadn't come to a full stop. My apologies." But Greg wasn't interested in her explanation. He glanced at her license again, this time with a smirk. "Maya Collins, huh? And what kind of work are you in?" Maya paused for a moment, debating whether to answer or let him draw his own conclusions. "I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said, her voice steady but firm. Greg's expression shifted, but instead of backing off, he frowned. "FBI, huh? Anyone can say that. Got proof?" Maya raised an eyebrow, her patience beginning to wear thin. She reached into her bag slowly and pulled out her badge, holding it up for him to see. The gold emblem gleamed in the sunlight, unmistakable in its authenticity. But Greg didn't back down. Instead, his expression hardened, and he said something that made Maya's stomach tighten. "Step out of the car." Maya knew this wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. She calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, her FBI credentials still in hand. She kept her posture straight, her mind already calculating her next move. What Greg didn't realize was that this encounter would soon take a turn he would never forget. Maya stepped out of her SUV, her every movement calm and deliberate. She was no stranger to tense situations, but this one felt different. She wasn't on a mission or undercover. This was her life, her identity, being questioned on the side of the road for no justifiable reason. Clutching her FBI badge in one hand, she kept her other hand visible at her side, aware of how easily things could escalate if she made a wrong move. Officer Greg Barnes stood a few feet away, his stance rigid and his expression guarded. He glanced at the badge in her hand, but didn't seem convinced. "Anyone can flash a shiny badge," he muttered. "Where's the proof that it's real?" Maya held his gaze, her patience starting to thin. "Officer, my credentials are legitimate. You've seen my badge, and my name is on my driver's license. If you have any doubts, you're welcome to contact the FBI to verify." But Greg wasn't interested in making a call. His pride and preconceived notions had taken over, clouding his judgment. To him, This was about control. He wasn't going to let a driver, especially one like Maya, dictate how the stop would proceed. "I'll decide what I believe," he said firmly. "Turn around and place your hands on the car." Maya blinked, surprised by the command. She stayed still for a moment, weighing her options. As an FBI agent, she knew her rights, and this wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone in a position of power who overstepped their authority. But she also knew that escalating the situation could make things worse. "Officer, I need you to explain why you're asking me to do this," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I've complied with every request so far. I don't see a reason for this." Greg stepped closer, his hand resting near his holster. "Don't argue with me. Just do as I say." The tension was thick in the air, and Maya could feel the stares of a few bystanders who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. She took a deep breath, deciding to comply for now, knowing she had the tools and authority to address this later. She turned and placed her hands on the hood of her SUV, her face calm, but her mind racing. Greg pulled out a pair of handcuffs, his movements deliberate as if to make a point. "Let's see how real that badge is once we're at the station," he said, a smug tone in his voice. Maya didn't respond, but her silence wasn't compliance. It was calculation. She knew she had to let this play out, but she was already formulating her next steps. Greg didn't realize it, but every move he made was digging himself into a deeper hole. As he placed the cuffs on her wrists, Maya thought about what this moment represented, not just for her, but for the countless others who had been judged unfairly. She knew she couldn't let this end here. What Greg didn't understand was that the woman he was trying to humiliate had the power to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The clink of handcuffs echoed in the quiet suburban street as Officer Greg Barnes secured them around Maya's wrists. A small crowd had started to gather at a distance, curious about the commotion. Maya remained calm, her expression steady even as her mind raced with frustration and disbelief. She had dealt with difficult situations in her line of work, but this was different. This was personal. Greg, on the other hand, seemed to grow more confident with every passing second. To him, this was just another routine stop gone right in his mind. A driver who needed to be taught a lesson about following the law. He didn't stop to think about why someone like Maya, who had presented herself so calmly and professionally, might be telling the truth. "Let's go," Greg said, guiding her toward his cruiser. He didn't notice the growing number of people watching from their porches and sidewalks. Nor did he seem to care. He was too focused on maintaining control of the situation, even if it meant ignoring the questions forming in his own mind. The badge she had shown looked real, and her demeanor was unlike anyone he'd ever arrested. But instead of pausing to think, he doubled down. As Maya sat in the back seat of the cruiser, she stayed silent, observing every detail. She had learned long ago that staying calm and collected was the best way to handle situations like this. Still, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Her position as an FBI agent gave her a certain level of authority. But in this moment, it didn't seem to matter. Greg hadn't listened, and his assumptions had led them both to this point. Back at the station, Greg led Maya inside, his confidence still intact. A few officers glanced up as they entered, their eyes widening slightly when they saw the woman in cuffs. Maya's poise and professional attire didn't fit the typical image of someone being brought in. Whispers started almost immediately. "Who's that?" one officer murmured to another. "No idea," came the reply. "But she doesn't look like she belongs here." Greg ignored the murmurs, guiding Maya to a desk where he began filling out paperwork. "You're going to regret pretending to be someone you're not," he said without looking at her. Maya finally broke her silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "Officer, I hope you're prepared to explain this when the truth comes out." Greg smirked. "Oh, the truth will come out. Trust me." Just then, another officer walked over, glancing at Maya's badge, which Greg had placed on the desk. His eyes widened as he picked it up. "Greg, "You might want to take another look at this," he said, his tone serious. "What?" Greg said, frowning as he turned toward his colleague. The officer leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This badge is real, Greg. She's FBI." Greg froze, the weight of those words hitting him like a ton of bricks. He looked at Maya, who met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I tried to tell you," she said simply. In that moment, Greg realized the gravity of his mistake. But what he didn't know was that Maya wasn't just going to let this slide. Her next move would ensure that he, and everyone watching, would think twice before making assumptions again. The room fell silent as the realization sank in. The badge in the other officer's hand gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the words "Federal Bureau of Investigation" were impossible to ignore. Greg's smirk faded, replaced by a mix of confusion and unease. His grip on the paperwork faltered as he looked at Maya, still seated calmly in front of him. "Wait, this can't be real," Greg muttered, taking the badge back to inspect it himself. He turned it over, examining every detail. But no matter how hard he tried to find something off about it, the badge was authentic. The officer standing next to him crossed his arms, giving Greg a pointed look. "Greg," the officer said quietly, "you might want to think about what you're doing. This isn't someone you should have brought in like this." Greg's confidence wavered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Anyone could have gotten a badge like this," he said defensively. "We don't know for sure yet." Maya, who had been silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was calm but carried the authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything. "Officer Barnes, I've given you my identification, my badge, and even my cooperation. At this point, your refusal to verify my credentials is no longer a mistake, it's negligence." Her words hung in the air, sharp and precise. Greg's face flushed as the weight of her statement settled in. The other officers in the room exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. It was clear that the situation was spiraling, and Greg was losing control of it. Before Greg could respond, another figure entered the room. A senior officer with decades of experience, someone whose presence commanded respect. Captain Harris took one look at Maya and immediately knew something was off. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm. Greg straightened up, trying to regain his composure. "Traffic stop, Captain. She claimed to be FBI, but I brought her in to verify her identity." Captain Harris frowned, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He stepped forward, picking up the badge from the desk. His expression shifted as he inspected it. "Greg, this is a legitimate badge. She's who she says she is." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Captain Harris raised a hand to silence him. "Did you even try to confirm her identity before bringing her in?" he asked, his tone growing colder. Greg stammered. "Well, I thought." "You thought wrong," Captain Harris snapped. He turned to Maya, his tone softening. "Agent Collins, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." Maya gave him a polite nod. "Thank you, Captain Harris. However, this isn't just about me. It's about the assumptions and biases that led to this situation in the first place. I intend to address it." Greg's face turned pale as the gravity of her words hit him. He realized that this wasn't going to end quietly or quickly. Maya's calm demeanor wasn't just professionalism. It was a clear signal that she intended to hold him accountable. As Captain Harris escorted Maya out of the station, Greg was left standing at the desk, his confidence shattered. He had no idea what was coming next, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Maya, on the other hand, walked out of the station with her head held high, already planning her next move to ensure that justice was served, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated. Maya walked out of the station with Captain Harris by her side, her posture calm and composed, though her mind was already racing with what needed to happen next. She had dealt with situations like this before, but this time felt different. It wasn't just about her being disrespected. It was about the systemic issues that allowed assumptions like Officer Barnes to persist. Maya wasn't the type to let things slide, and she knew this moment could spark a much-needed change. As they reached the parking lot, Captain Harris spoke again, his tone apologetic. "Agent Collins, I can't tell you how sorry I am for what happened back there. Officer Barnes clearly overstepped his authority, and I assure you we'll be handling this internally." Maya nodded, appreciating his sincerity, but knowing that internal action wouldn't be enough. "I understand, Captain, but this isn't just about one officer. It's about the culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Today, it was me. Tomorrow, it could be someone who doesn't have the resources or authority to defend themselves." Captain Harris looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right. What do you have in mind?" Maya took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "I'll be filing an official complaint, of course," she said. "But beyond that, I'd like to work with your department to implement training programs focused on bias awareness and de-escalation tactics. This can't just be about punishing one person. It has to be about creating a system that prevents this from happening in the first place." Captain Harris nodded slowly, impressed by her approach. "You have my full support, Agent Collins. I'll make sure the department cooperates fully." As Maya got into her car, she felt a sense of determination settle over her. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, but she was determined to make it one of the last, at least in this community. She drove away from the station, already drafting her report in her head and thinking of the steps she would take to ensure real change. Meanwhile, back inside the station, Officer Barnes sat at his desk, his confidence completely shattered. The other officers in the room avoided looking at him, and the silence was deafening. He replayed the events in his mind, realizing too late how badly he had handled the situation. His assumptions, his refusal to listen, and his stubbornness had all led to this moment. And now he would have to face the consequences. Captain Harris returned to the station and called Barnes into his office. The door closed, and the discussion that followed was firm and direct. Barnes was placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. Harris didn't mince words as he explained the seriousness of the situation. "This isn't just about you making a mistake, Rick," he said. "It's about how that mistake reflects on this entire department. We're here to serve and protect, not to act on assumptions or personal biases." As the day came to a close, the ripple effects of the incident were already beginning to spread. Maya's determination, Captain Harris's leadership, and Barnes's actions would set the stage for what came next. A push for accountability and reform that would leave no room for doubt about what kind of behavior was acceptable in law enforcement. For Maya, this was only the beginning. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was ready to walk it. Over the next few days, Maya Collins took action with precision and focus. Her first step was filing an official complaint against Officer Barnes, detailing every part of their encounter with clarity and professionalism. Maya wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for accountability. She knew her role as an FBI agent gave her a platform to address this issue in a way others might not be able to, and she intended to use it. Word of the incident began to spread quickly, both within the police department and throughout the community. People were talking, not just about what had happened, but about what it represented. For many, it was a stark reminder of the challenges people faced every day when assumptions and biases dictated behavior. Maya's calm but firm response to the situation had made an impression, inspiring conversations about change. Captain Harris wasted no time in addressing the issue internally. He scheduled a meeting with the department's leadership team to discuss the need for reform. "This incident is a wake-up call," he said, his tone serious. "If we're going to regain the trust of this community, we need to take real steps toward improvement. That means training, accountability, and ensuring incidents like this don't happen again." Meanwhile, Maya began reaching out to community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even local government officials. She proposed a series of workshops and training sessions that would focus on implicit bias, effective communication, and de-escalation techniques. The goal wasn't to single out or shame officers. It was to build a stronger foundation for mutual respect and understanding between law enforcement and the public. At first, there was resistance. Some officers felt defensive, arguing that one mistake shouldn't define their entire department. But as more people heard Maya's story and saw her approach, opinions began to shift. Her focus wasn't on tearing anyone down. It was on building something better. Slowly, people started to listen. One afternoon, Captain Harris invited Maya to speak at a department-wide meeting. The room was filled with officers, some skeptical, others curious. Maya stood at the front, her presence commanding but approachable. She began by sharing her perspective, not just as an FBI agent, but as a person who had experienced judgment based on assumptions throughout her life. "I'm not here to point fingers," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to talk about what we can do better. We all have biases, every single one of us. But recognizing them and working to overcome them is what makes us stronger, both as individuals and as a team." Her words resonated with many in the room. She spoke about the importance of empathy, the value of listening, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. By the time she finished, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Officers who had entered the room skeptical now nodded in agreement, some even approaching her afterward to thank her for her insight. For Officer Barnes, however, the process was more difficult. He had been placed on suspension and was undergoing a disciplinary review. Sitting at home, he reflected on his actions and the fallout that had followed. For the first time, he began to understand the consequences of his assumptions, not just for himself, but for the people he was supposed to serve. As the weeks went on, the changes Maya had set in motion began to take shape. Training sessions were scheduled, new policies were drafted, and the community began to see signs of progress. For Maya, this was a small but meaningful victory. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she was committed to seeing it through. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about creating a future where respect and fairness weren't exceptions, but the norm. Weeks had passed since the incident between Maya and Officer Barnes, but the ripple effects of that day were still being felt throughout the community. Change was in the air, and it was impossible to ignore. Maya had stayed true to her mission, working tirelessly to ensure that what had happened to her would serve as a catalyst for something bigger, a shift in how law enforcement approached their role in the community. One morning, Maya received a call from Captain Harris. "Agent Collins," he said, his tone warm but professional. "We've just finalized the first series of training sessions you suggested. I wanted to personally invite you to speak at the opening session next week." Maya smiled. "Thank you, Captain. I'd be honored to be there." The following week, the training session took place in the department's largest conference room. Officers from all ranks were present, seated in neat rows, some looking intrigued, others a little wary. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of curiosity. They had all heard about Maya, her professionalism, her patience, and her determination to bring about change. Maya stood at the front of the room, calm and confident as always. She began by sharing her story, recounting the events of that day not with anger, but with honesty. "I'm not here to lecture or point fingers," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I believe we all have the ability to grow, to be better, and to create a stronger connection with the communities we serve." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord. She spoke about the importance of empathy, of seeing people as individuals rather than assumptions or stereotypes. She emphasized how small actions, like listening, pausing, and thinking before acting, could make all the difference in building trust. As Maya continued, she noticed the officers leaning forward in their seats, their expressions softening. Even those who had initially been skeptical seemed to be reconsidering their perspectives. She ended her speech with a challenge. "Let's commit to being the best versions of ourselves, not just as officers, but as people." The room erupted in applause, and as Maya stepped down, several officers approached her to shake her hand. "Thank you," one officer said. "We needed this." Captain Harris, who had been watching from the side, approached Maya with a look of admiration. "You've made an incredible impact here," he said. "This department is better because of you." Meanwhile, Officer Barnes had been watching from the back of the room. His suspension was still in effect, but he had been allowed to attend the session as part of his disciplinary process. As he listened to Maya, he felt a mixture of guilt and gratitude. Her words weren't just about what he had done. They were about what he could do moving forward. After the session, Barnes hesitated but finally walked up to Maya. "Agent Collins," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I just want to say, I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't see it then, but I do now. And I'm going to work on being better." Maya studied him for a moment before nodding. "Apology accepted, Officer Barnes," she said. "Change isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Just remember, it's about action, not just words." As Barnes walked away, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't proud of his actions, but he was determined to learn from them. For Maya, the moment reaffirmed her belief in the power of dialogue and accountability. The journey wasn't over, but progress was being made, one step at a time.